Hello, in this video, I will be discussing the purpose of rubrics and the use of rubrics in the English district curriculum. I'll be talking about analytic and single point rubrics, the purpose of them, and how they can be used. So let's take a look at a first intended purpose, which is to inform students about the learning expectations. So it's about clarity for learning targets and expectations. This example rubric comes from the English 11 Module 1, which is about reading rhetorically. So a little bit about the format on the top, you can see in this case, there are 3 priority targets. That is in this top box here. In this case, it happens to be to determine multiple claims in a text, determine the author's purpose, and analyze how content contributes to the persuasiveness of the text. In parentheses, you can see the standards, the Common Core standards that these align to. So essentially, these priority targets, as we call them, are broken down from the standards. They're in smaller pieces. They're put in a little bit more student-friendly language. And we're saying that these priority targets are the specific targets that we want all of our students to achieve proficiency on, which is this green column here, by the end of the unit. That is our goal. All of our practices, all of our feedback, and finally our summative assessment are all going to be aligned to these specific priority targets, sometimes called learning targets or outcomes, whatever you want to call that. But that is the idea. So let's look at the top row of this rubric. We can see these 4 different performance levels: mastery, proficient, developing, and beginning. You notice that there are no numbers, no letters here. That's on purpose, because when there are numbers and letters, students tend to focus on grades as opposed to learning. Now, we know that they've been taught to do that for a long, long time. And it takes a while to get them off that. But part of that is just to remove those things that really distract them, those distractors. So that's the purpose for that. Now, we know eventually they do have to be graded at the end of the learning progress. So when that does happen, then mastery will be translated into an A, proficient B, developing C, beginning D, and no score or no learning would be an F. But until that time, we want to just focus on those performance levels. So on the left side, you will see the 3 different priority targets that I just mentioned in that the top of the rubric. So those are on here. So we have 3 rows, 1 row for each of the priority targets. Again, these targets are what will eventually be summatively assessed at the end of the unit. Inside of each box, a brief description of what that performance level would look like for that particular priority target. So a good place to start is in the proficient column, and that's why it's in green. And a good place to do this would be at the beginning of the module, and perhaps at the beginning of each lesson too. So if we check out that first box, proficient for determining multiple claims, says that a student accurately identifies the main claim and supporting claim in a text. So we want students to know exactly what we're talking about, or as close as possible. Now, one thing about rubrics is it's really hard to be too specific, because we don't want it to be overwhelming. We want it to be as clear as possible. So it does help to provide student exemplars to help to support so they can see what that would look like. But this is a starting point for clarity. Again, we want to go through each of these different standards at the beginning of the module and then at the beginning of each of the lessons. Okay, moving on. Second main purpose of rubrics is to provide feedback during the learning process. So this feedback is from teacher to student, from student to student, hopefully, and then also maybe student to self and self-assessment. So we have 2 ways to do that with rubrics. Number 1 is, well, use that same rubric. It can be used for formative purposes. So hopefully all of these assignments that you use and everything in the district curriculum does align to these rubrics. So we can use these rubrics with all of the practices, right? And so we want to provide feedback, of course, for a lot of the practices. We can't do it for all, but those important practices especially, and we can use these rubrics to provide that feedback to make sure that it's specific and to be as helpful as possible to get students prepared for that summative assessment. So there's one way to do that. Another way is a little bit more focused way, a different format though. This is called a single point rubric. So you can see there's a little bit different structure here. Something we'll point out that will jump out is this proficient column is all that is present. We don't have the mastery, developing, or beginning columns. So this example comes from the English 9 plot identification rubric and module. And again, it's just the proficient column. So the purpose of this is to help get rid of some of the other clutter in the rubric to help students to focus specifically on that column. On the left and the right, you notice will be some blank columns. That is room for specific feedback. We use the glows and grows model here. And the purpose of this is to provide students with some specific feedback about what they're doing well on the left for that particular part of the rubric, and then what they need to do better on the right. So it's really important to provide both of these. This balance is really key for that continual learning growth. And then for students who have already reached proficiency, you'll notice on the bottom here, almost cut off, but at the bottom, that's room for students who are ready for extended learning, or for students who are trying to get to that mastery category. For students who aren't there yet, you might even leave that blank, but it is there. So again, 2 different possible rubrics to provide feedback during the learning process for the teaching and the learning part, which is most of our modules, right? Most of the time in our modules is during this particular stage. And then lastly, last but not least, we can't forget, yes, eventually students will be evaluated using these rubrics. Notice that these are the same rubrics throughout. So these rubrics are designed for skills. They do not differ by task. They're based off the skills specifically. So the same rubric that we use at the beginning of the unit and throughout the middle, we're using at the end to evaluate. Hopefully we can provide feedback too, so students can have retake possibilities. And eventually this is how they're graded, right, based off of that rubric. So 3 main purposes for rubrics: clarity, feedback, evaluation. Hope this is helpful. Thanks for watching.